Hello, everyone. Oh, okay, it really does work. Okay. Um, it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce.
Could you speak into the microphone?
It's a no. Maybe turn it a bit. Okay. Is this a bit better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Great. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Heather Treseler and a wonderful first collection, Auguries and Divinations, which received the 2013 Maysart and New Hampshire Poetry Prize. And her poetry before that had appeared in a double award-winning chapbook, I believe, Parturition, and it appeared in lots and lots of prestigious magazines and periodicals. And actually, so have her essays about poetry and about other things, and they're essays which are lively and readable, but also sophisticated in a way that I think literary criticism should be. And they're essays that have changed the way I think about poetry, and especially a poet close to my heart, Elizabeth Bishop. So I could go on talking about that and about all the awards and fellowships, including teaching awards, which I think is very important to talk about, that Heather has received, but I should say something about the book, right? Now, I think that the problem I had was that the praise that one finds on the back of poetry collections, and sometimes on the pages inside, if you're lucky and you get lots of praise, is not always the most illuminating, even when it is very effusive. But in this case, it really is. So if you buy the book, and I think you should, I'd also encourage you to really read the praise on the back of the book and inside it, because in many cases, in this case, it's not just praise, it's intelligent criticism. So why is that a problem for me? It's a problem for me because it kind of steals my thunder, what I was going to say, especially as an observation by Willard Spiegelman about how rhymes are interlaced through the collection. And I was definitely planning a sort of clever riff on that, but he's already said that. So I won't say that. What I will say, what should I say? I'll say something about this really capacious and multifaceted collection, and about how the poems in it are times both carefully and ingeniously loco-descriptive, and at other times, or the same time, simultaneously, they're really psychologically trenchant. Heather writes about the desperate nullities of tidy, self-regarding suburbs. She writes about the angsts of childhood, both the poet's and her mother's. And notably, but not exclusively, in a really ambitious sequence, the Lucy Odes, she writes about the assaults on their dignity, their bodies, and sometimes their very lives that women suffer and which women survive. There are poems here inspired by Elizabeth Bishop, by Anne Sexton. There is verse in the voice of Maxine Cumin. There also seems to be, as I reread the book today, sort of wry engagements with the phrasing, the lyrical idioms of major male poets, as we call them, like Wallace Stevens, Robert Lowell, and I wonder even maybe Philip Larkin, although I might just be imagining it, in Labor Day. We'll have a chance to talk about that afterwards. What else? Well, maybe because we might talk a bit after the reading, I'll end it there, but not without saying that I think Auguries and Divinations is in part a book of the body. It's a book of the body in a very self-aware way, because it's very aware of the ways in which bodies, especially women's bodies, have been talked about, the ways in which women have been prevented from talking about their bodies. And it's trying to find ways of talking about and through the body in a sort of better way, a way that is more inventive and also more just. It talks about queer and disabled bodies. It explores the ignitions of desire, but also the cognitions of desire. And it treats love as a mode of knowledge. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Heather Treseler.
I'm a lot shorter. It's such an honor to be introduced by the poet and scholar and critic of my generation, for whom I have the most respect and regard. Vidyan's book on Elizabeth Bishop, which I read 6 years ago, taught me anew how to hear her poems' music, their prose cadences and subtle sonics. And his book also emboldened me to sort of continue indulging my love of sound and shape as much as story as I was working in earnest on this book. How's the sound for folks? Speaking of sound, good? Okay. Good. Good point. Yeah. No.
Is that okay?
That's great. It's always your best friend who will tell you when something doesn't fit. And it's also very lovely and meaningful to be gathered here with a core of people, including Anthony Walton, Lloyd Schwartz, Megan Marshall, Emily McMains, Rohit Chandra, and James Frazier, who offered various kinds of encouragement in the nearly decade-long project of this book. So last night, I had the chance to reread Vidyan's most recent book of poems, which I highly recommend to you, The Million-Petaled Flower of Being Here, which is a collection of sonnets for his wife, the fiction writer Jenny Holden. They're sonnets that are full of deep thought and provocation and song. And I thought this morning that I might structure this reading around poems having to do with love. And also, I know that there are a few repeat customers in the audience who have heard me read from this book before. And I was thinking about A.R. Ammon's line that a new walk is a new walk, right? So tonight, a new reading should be a new reading. So I'll be reading 8 poems. And this first poem is called Petrichor. And for the scientists in the audience, you know already what that means. It's the smell that we smell. It's quite pleasant after it's rained following a period of drought. And it's a word that was first used or coined in 1964, first appeared in the journal Nature. And my pedantic footnotes will fill you in on the rest. But it's from two word roots, right? Pet or PTR, meaning rock, and ichor, which is what flows through the veins of gods. And it's just a delicious word. Petrichor. Back home, the smell of your skin resined on mine, sweet and musky as jessamine, ozone, petrichor. 3 magi of rain's arrival, scents we have evolved to track, pulling down the tent, rounding up saddles and fire, hunting with animal need. For want of you, I disassemble what I have called home, fleeing a season of bewilderment, and having seen by ragged light my nakedness, our plight, the slow devastation of drought, plant life refusing germination, hiding juice in sullen roots, holding memories of rain in archives of seed. I had stopped counting winters, stopped gauging thirst or hunger, ceased to feel skin's thinned paper, anxious limbs, thirst its own cavity, a deep well of unslaken. You were not a mirage in an old Western, an isle of green in a desiccated desert. You are not a Christological cactus. You do not ride a horse or hobby horse parading manliness, but long and cool, like gin on ice, this permission to need, to covet the salve of another's skin, to hanker after wild scent as it's released from the resin of rock. You offered me your mouth, and I could barely stop for air. As you might guess from the title of the book, Auguries and Divinations, there's a fair amount about birds in this book. So for those of you who read classical literature and made your way through middle school Latin, you'll probably remember that in ancient Rome, no major political decision could be made and no battle could be waged without the high priests first taking the augurs, which meant consulting with the birds. They didn't actually engage them in conversation, but they noticed their patterns of flight. They occasionally examined their entrails, and from observing the birds, made forecasts about when the Senate should vote and when war should be waged. And I sometimes think, that might actually be a good political process to return to, one more reliable. So the other interesting thing that I learned is that during the season of courtship, only the male sparrows sing, which is interesting. And the sparrow also figures in the love poems of Gaius Catullus, who's usually regarded as sort of the father of the love poem. And he has two poems addressed to his girlfriend's or would-be girlfriend's pet sparrow. In the first, he sort of laments the fact that she's paying a lot more attention to petting the sparrow than to petting him. And then in the second poem, it's sort of a mock elegy. He laments the sudden, unexpected, inexplicable death of the sparrow, leaving most readers to draw their own conclusions about the poor bird. So this is set in the American suburbs, not in ancient Rome, but it's about listening to sparrows. My study has a tall linden tree outside of it, and it's basically a sparrow chorus hall. Sparrow. Song for you is mostly male, mostly advertising. Ladies for a good nest and good time. In the arthritic maple and linden trees of this tidy, self-regarding suburb, dozens of bird banjos strum with an insistence, usually blamed on rowdy hormones. I can't help but think of Catullus in his mortgaged villa, back from serving empire, finding little joy in his familiar bed as he spins in the torn sail of his sheets, pining for Clodia, whose talent is seduction, whose sultry gaze and long-legged stride inflame him while she ignores his pleas, letting a pet sparrow tease and sate her lust instead of his own eager member. As if Congress were a law of perfectly mutual enactments. As if the trees, warbling with urgency and would, pantomime the almost alimentary need for touch, or the tragedy of flourishing in just one settled plot. O sparrow, an ancient Roman stirs in your feathered chest, DJs a body carpe diem, playing Darwin's bell in the morning ballad of the hard cell. This next poem is about a different kind of love. When I was 10, my family moved to Newton, which sort of became my adopted hometown. And I was trying to get a sense of what this place was all about. We just moved there from Hyde Park, and I was sort of mystified by the prevalence of play dates, like kids just didn't go out in the street and hang out. And in an attempt to understand this new place, I went to the library. And I asked the librarians for books by writers from Newton. And they said, well, what kind? And I said, well, I like poems. And this wonderful, insightful librarian guided me towards reading Maxine Kumin and Anne Sexton, most of which I probably didn't understand at that age. But I did fall in love with Sexton's music. And also, Kumin was writing about things that I like to do at that time, swim and run and explore the woods. And then I later learned that Kumin and Sexton had first met in an adult education class in Boston. And they were working with John Holmes in a workshop. And they became friends, even though they were very different in their personas and personalities. Sexton had worked as a secretary and as a fashion model. Kumin had both an undergraduate and a graduate degree from Radcliffe. And despite their temperamental differences, which were significant, and other differences, they became good friends and, in fact, collaborators. And one of the more charming anecdotes about their friendship is that in order to workshop their poems, they were both very busy raising their children and running households. They got a private line between their two homes in Newton, and they would work on poems together during the course of the day. And when they needed to abandon that task to go, wake someone up from a nap or something, they would leave the phone off the hook. And when they were ready to resume, one would whistle into the receiver to sort of signal the other that it was time to work on poems again. And they both, of course, went on to win the Pulitzer and have very distinguished writing careers. I interviewed Maxine Kumin in 2005 when she was in her 80s. And one of the things she said in that interview was that breaking into print in the early 60s as a woman was extremely difficult, and that she and Sexton felt like, quote, some species of rare flightless bird. Wire. I cradled the phone in one hand, poem in another, schooled by years of reading while babies nursed, book, breast, and a baby's fawn head forming a triptych, feeding in the dark. When Anne and I got serious, we split the cost of a private line, calling to read each other's drafts between lunch and laundry, each hour a petty theft from the ordinary, homemaking in all its glory. I took my master's at Radcliffe 8 months along, and they made me promise I would not continue. From Stendhal to diapers. I still hear Anne's voice on the wire. She whistled into the receiver when she was ready. Half lullaby, half cigarette cackle, teasing me to venture beyond the known and tidy, to make stories of our lives, of what we saw and knew. Somehow, this was revolution, and we were each other's imagined freedom, the best we could have or hope for in a mother or a lover, a comrade. For once, I had enough. With Anne, I was infant, unable to speak in dumb delight beside cry and suckle, mule and hard, greedy draw. But by law of what is female, she woke in me a wail, and we fed each other, growing books and names like the strangely misshapen hero vegetables of suburban gardens, dim with soil and sublimation. In the antiphone of call and answer, we learned to put it all on the line. This next poem is called Nocturne, and it continues on the theme of female friendship. And, Virginia Woolf famously said that women think through their mothers, and I think that's often true. And I also think we sort of dream through our peers. So this is for my friend Emily McMains. We were introduced by a poet. We were actually sort of set up on like a friend's date by a poet that we were both studying with at the time, the late Michael Harper. He said to me one day in office hours, "There's this woman from Baton Rouge who's really smart. I think you should get to know her." And I guess he said something similar to Emily. And 20 odd years later, you know, we're still in conversation. So this is called Nocturne, and it's about sort of finding our way as women, and the kinds of choices we make to try to find our way forward. Nocturne. We left the bland art show as if it were on fire, fleeing a painter who refused to imagine anything he had not seen, his version of realism, rebuking color and angled light. No wonder, you said, he killed himself. All that skill stuck in a scornful eye, a fly, an ointment, no out. We spill from a side door into September, college crowds of nubile bodies, bright sea of pheromones. Leggy, listless, your daughters fuss and bored hunger as you steer them in the minivan cocoon, as safe and warm as a living room, a velour and chrome wheeling womb. At the restaurant, Julia posits that ketchup and mustard mixed together form ketchup, species of vinegar and stored seed. Annie, ever the older sister, one-ups with what to do in your natural disaster. Instruction she gives us with the gelid calm of a newscaster. Sisters, sharing the predicament of parents, glacial crises of female bodies. It will draw them together, cleave them apart, in the veteran fight of the umbilicus, wanting its one mouth tethered without rival to the breadbox of blood, its frayed edge a flower from a fallen world, a Victrola horn cut from the music box of mother. Annie taps my shoulder. In tsunamis, you follow the animals inland. In tornadoes, you climb into a cellar or a ditch. In landslides, hold your breath, go limp, don't resist. She slumps her hard-angled frame against my softer own, while Julia stirs her apple juice worriedly with a French fry. These things don't happen in New England, you interject, or very rarely, you add, qualifying the fable with fact for your eldest, who will take you to task. Years ago, as a scientist, an expert in the optics of fish, you wagered it better to give your daughters faith in an earth equal parts theft and gift, more rapture than repine. The girls confer, ask to be excused. We watch their haphazard cartwheels in the grass, downy legs milling air, long hair grazing ground. To bear them, you left the lab, the blue-green vision of the Arctic cod that has evolved not to see red. You chose marriage, a job with mother's hours, as each woman drives a bargain, hoping it won't cost the joy of her life. Your neighbor spots us and stops to say hello. Are your kids here? He asks, and I shake my head, wondering if I have lived too much for myself. When he leaves, we are again two women, friends taking stock of their chosen. 20 years ago, shy, bookish tomboys drunk on possibility, We stayed up all night at the library, stumbling out come morning, dazed by the rawness of light. We were not yet midlife mammals hunting haven, not women wary of their own extinction, not a painting unimagined of unspent color and light. We are creatures entering the waters of remaking, grown in gills and grist. We swim in the dark, downward kingdom of purblind fish, dreaming a fata morgana yet to appear, yet to exist, land of the unbartered wish. And now for a short poem. This is called Wager. Could be subtitled How to Offend Your Neighbors. Wager. For you, I have left my clothes on the floor. I have left windows open in the bedroom. We might scandalize the neighbors. We might entertain house painters. We might captivate a stag line of squirrels on the telephone wire, watching what we do, touch, both tender and terrifying, naked fate in small furies of love. Pairs of fleshly doors opening to rapture or metaphor. A chance to be momently carried across into somewhere, something, someone else. Okay. So this next poem requires a little bit of context. There is an absolutely wonderful biography that I all urge you to read. It's a great summer read, The Peabody Sisters by Megan Marshall, who's here. It was the first book I treated myself to in the pandemic, and I was actually limiting myself to only about 10 pages a day toward the end because I didn't want it to end. It's a biography of three sisters, all of whom led extraordinary lives. And this poem is about Sophia Peabody, or Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, who met and married Nathaniel Hawthorne at an age which in 19th century standards was sort of older than most, and some would say, sort of past their shelf dates. Their first year together, they lived in the old manse in Concord, and you can still find, it's quite clear actually, the inscriptions that Sophia carved with her diamond in the window of the old manse, which is a pretty daring thing to do as a renter, right? But I think posterity is grateful. They were tremendously happy, and but they also suffered sort of grievous loss that first year or two together. And this is about that. It's called First Grief. Late to love, later still to marriage, they assumed little, having foraged for each other. So even as the signs seemed clear and Sophia's courses stopped, they knew the danger in forecasts, whims of wind and weather, and spoke little of their gathered hope. So when she slipped from the stalwart arm of her beloved and fell hard against the frozen face of Concord River, she tried not to regard the basket of blood as more than an accident, a freak fall, a first loss demanding of them more tenderness and stern reminder in their newlywed bliss of the dark currents that swell and course beneath gray ice, how a sudden crack in winter's river devours as quick as any storied tragedy. What had begun in a sweet flood of 4 limbs, pulsing blood, and a narrow bed swum as if black water. Okay, last 3 poems. This next one is from the perspective of a child or young person. And the title of it is Egyptian Wing. And it takes place in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I was a fairly curious, bookish kid, and I always felt like I wasn't quite getting the full answer on things. And that kind of, through no fault of the adults in my life, but I was just really curious and felt like a lot of the usual answers weren't satisfying, including some of the answers in religion. And I'll also say, too, that it refers to an illness my mother had when I was an early teen, but she survived it and is giving us all heck and high water on the regular. It's great. Okay, so Egyptian Wing. Lost in the museum on Saturdays in the wine-dark rooms of Egyptian tombs, because my mother had a disorder of the blood, and no one would tell me anything I could believe of death. Her bed raised high as an ancient altar of stone worn by a priest's blade. There she lay cordoned off, beyond touch, like a carved artifact the centuries have filigreed with hairline fissures of light. I was told to pray to the poor man who hung lashed to his lumber, his ribs a staircase to a face of agony, strangely cleansed of terror. This was no God to save a mother. Whereas the Egyptians had followed a creed of birds, even the tomb was called an egg. And while mummy an accident of sound, not sense, there was tender swaddling and death clothes, each body bathed in Nile salt and stuffed with fragrant spices, organs parsed in canopic jars, like the grammar, subject, predicate of a sentence. To be sent off, as if to summer camp, with pets, snacks, and details for care and handling. For that afterlife, I prayed to falcon-headed Horus and the winged soul of the heart. Weren't birds commuting between a bitter earth and sky, making an eros of pitched precision, mothering a small body toward its horizon? Okay. So I know summer is just getting underway, so it feels a little unfair to read a poem called Labor Day, projecting the end of our season. But this poem could also be subtitled, Why I'm Not Coming to Your Barbecue. Riding home with the windows down, I know what I'm missing. The picnic and wine mom Chardonnay, microbrews and frisbee, or a grill of charred meat, chilled rosé. A sweet little kid sneaking a brownie as big as her head. We offer one last salute to summer before the hurried business that is September. School slowly narrowed to the end run of commerce. And like a cartoon or cosmic joke, I'm the feminist professor stuck behind a truck named for a mythic woman warrior, or the world's largest river. This optimized delivery service threads subdued streets with the stealthy ease of a hearse, making its almost silent doorstop annunciations. At least I'm not late for a barbecue, where I'd calculate the potato salad's bacterial load and wonder if my sleeve's toxic spray might hold blood-hungry bugs at bay. So goes the romance of nature, which does not care for anyone in its rude force. What we try to weed and bed, fence off and fertilize. What I sensed was a sad charade, watching my father aerate the tired lawn with soccer cleats and a pitchfork. As a kid at ritual gatherings, I'd slip off when the cousins got peevish and listen to adults posture about politics. These days, it's still more work than leisure to eat a neighbor's hamburger and chat about a safari or market rally. 7 stages of kitchen renovation. Junior's ukulele. And I think of the women in my family preparing each feast, working the second shift, wearing seasonal cheer. On their collective behalf, I drive straight home, where I won't count napkin rings or iron a tablecloth, solve an insult, or spare the sauce. I know it's of no general concern whether I spent the summer writing and unwriting a book and hoping my lover isn't audible over the air conditioner that rattles, bleats, sweats, and purrs undeterred. I have no daughter, no son. Some might say no sum to show for my day's math. How I've sought to add, or just as carefully subtract. There is license in a life that appears a little less. Its deepest cares never turn to work, with a lover who's not my co-investor or delivery service. So I wave to be friendly at the block party rave and seek out my beloved who sits reading at dusk, awaiting the company of my lust, patient as a myth or a river ambling south. Thank you.
Sure. That's my copy of the book. Oh, I was sitting on it the whole time. Clever notes are in there.
Sure.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Speaking to the microphone. So yeah, because you read Labor Day, I have to ask if there is some sort of shade of Philip Larkin somewhere in that poem.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Because I was reading it, and I was thinking, yeah, I mean that's England, not New England. But I was thinking about his poems, which were about, he's watching other people having a good time, and he's not as perhaps not as generous as you are in his gaze at those people.
Sure.
But there is maybe something in how he manages to create a space away from those people and get away from those people. I was wondering if there was something there that you were not, that you were extending in a really original way.
I'm so glad that you picked up on my Larkin crush. There is definitely, I think, I was thinking a bit of Wits and Weddings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think for me, he was a poet that I was introduced to at school, and I really, I didn't think I had anything in common with this person, and certainly not with his politics, and he's not someone I ever want to meet. But
right.
Could you speak into the microphone?
And he's certainly not someone I would ever want to meet. Philip Larkin, that is. But then there's this sense of like what one's poetic affiliations are, or who the poets are whose voices sort of come back, you know, in your own voice, and they're not always poets who are like you or who would like you. You know, there's sometimes very different people to you. So anyway, yeah, that's it just so stood out to me.
Well, I'm glad that that is the case. I'll say too that Larkin isn't really someone I would want to spend time with, but he's marvelous on the page, and he was had such a feeling for the music of language.
Yeah.
And also, I hope my social critique is a little bit more tender than his often was. But I think he was sort of carving out a space that wasn't conscripted by generalized feeling.
Yeah, yeah, that puts it much better than I did. Yeah, I think that's right. Um, well, I think on the subject of the musical, I think that's something we should talk about because your poems are wonderfully musical, and what Willard Spiegelman says about rhyme. I mean, sometimes you actually end a poem with a couplet. Sometimes you have these sort of these lovely and thoughtful internal rhymes in the middle of poems that sort of catch the reader slightly off guard. Or maybe that's not the best way of putting it, because as I read it, it was more like, what was it like, sort of helping you out in a way as a reader. It's like a sort of a little enhancement of your attention at that point. And that was something that I really loved in these poems. And maybe it's sort of too nerdily specific and sort of word bound. But yeah, I didn't know if you had anything to say about that.
Sure. Yeah. Years ago, like this is going back 15 years, someone asked me if I was a formalist, and I said, "Oh God, no," you know. But I was sort of educated in a fairly classical way, and read a lot of Latin and and older English. And so I think some of the sonic qualities of language that I'm interested in, it's not particularly hip, but it's kind of what I do. You know, I like poems to sound good, but also to feel good in the mouth, and for there to be pleasure in the saying and pleasure in the reading that's visceral as well as cognitive, I guess.
Yeah, you know, that's a really great way of expressing it. I guess it is something that I often miss, um, even in the contemporary poetry I love for other reasons. That there is something like maybe it's a craving for something sensuous and textual, and something like Heaney or Keats or Bishop or any number of poets for whom, you know, the verse sound was a really important part of what they were trying to say. And the idea that the verse sounds were also a way of thinking about the things that their poems were thinking about. Um, I'm not sure if perhaps we should see if there are any questions that anyone wants to ask you.
Yes, Megan.
I wonder, thank you for lovely reading, more than lovely, magnificent.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could say something about how biography appeals to you, or how you use it in poetry, because you have Sophia, you have Maxine Kuhlman and Anne Sexton and other people. What draws you to that? Is it, and how does it help?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Megan, and I have you to thank for making sure I stay historically accurate when I'm talking about Sophia, Peabody Hawthorne, and other figures. I think I'm, you know, the line from L.P. Hartley's book, which is often quoted, "The past is a different country. They do things differently there," comes to mind in as much as another era is both foreign and familiar. And so thinking about and writing about, say, the friendship of Kuhlman and Sexton was a way of me thinking about what women of my mother's own age and older were sort of up against in their own pursuit of their ambitions and desires. So some of these historical figures are an attempt to look at quote unquote contemporary problems, but with a historical lens at other lives, and how these difficulties were, if not resolved, worked through to some kind of satisfying end. You know, one of the things that you bring out in your book is that Sophia largely stopped working as an artist once her children arrived. And um, that's heartbreaking, I think, to me. um, but also sort of symptomatic of, um, you know, uh, how much work and how much mileage we have to do sometimes to seek our own liberation, I guess. That sounds very highfalutin, but, you know.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
You're a very eloquent prose writer. And everybody knows the difference between writing poetry and writing prose. Is there anything common for you about your prose writing and your poetry writing?
Oh, these are such wonderful questions. I think I've been told, and I think it's true, that I'm obsessed with syntax. And I spend a lot of time when I'm even composing prose and even journalistic prose, and this is something I admire about Vidyan's work as well, is that his work always sounds really good. And there's a craft to the sentence itself. And that's something I aspire to, I think, in my own prose and poetry. So, you know, I'm always wondering if my nearest neighbors think I have some sort of problem because I'm always reading out loud to myself. It's very evident there's no company there. So, but I think that might be one shared thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I do that on the commuter rail sometimes, and yeah, you do get looks, which is surprising because now, you know, I could be talking on the phone or something, but people seem to know that I'm reading out something to myself. Maybe there's a particular kind of utterance that goes with reading out to yourself. It's just like ears cock up and the thing. I suppose it's great,
Yes.
or something like that. Are there any other questions? I'm not sure what the best thing to do is then. I mean, I could definitely go on talking about the book in probably quite a tedious way. Yeah.
Of the poems that you read, which one do you feel like had the most of, that's a weird way to say it, the most of your spirit in it? Of just the ones you read.
That feels like a spiritual question. I sort of feel like I need to consult with a priest.
Not that kind of stuff.
I'm a long lapsed Catholic. I think the poem Egyptian Wing was one that I wrote sort of surprisingly quickly. And it was, you know, I had high school mentor, the one that Emily and I shared, Michael Harper, and he said to me at one point in an office hour conversation that at the time I found very challenged and frustrated by, but has since sort of become prophecy. He turned to me and said, you know, it's going to probably take you 20 years to write the kinds of poems you're trying to write. And I quickly calculated in my head and thought, like, well, I hope I'm still kicking by then, you know. But sure enough, you know, I wish he was still with us because he was completely right. I was still looking for the tools and the language to approach the material that I had, and it took a couple decades. So, thank you. Row it, yeah.
I asked about Michael Harper, in addition to the wonderful connections that he made for you and what he taught you. Do you feel like you carry some of them with you in your voice or in the content of your poetry? How has he shaped you?
Wonderful question. So Michael was a fascinating poet, and I think is still earning his full appreciation now, in part because he didn't fit into any narrow box. He was in many ways a modernist, and he was as interested in Wallace Stevens as he was John Coltrane. And the scope of his style and his own affinities was broad enough that I think critics haven't been able to slot him in to the canon, or whatever it is now, the deconstructed canon, in a neat way. But he always encouraged me to read in his own words, read promiscuously, right? And cultivate affinities that seemed attuned to the material and to some sort of inner music. I remember him saying to me once in office hours, which he held, by the way, between 7 and 9 on Friday mornings.
Was that a strategic thing?
Oh, yes. Yes. The shocking thing was that there was often a line, there are at least 3 other former students of his in the audience, and they'll attest to that. But now, as a professor myself, kind of understand. Where was I going with this? He said to me once, we were talking about music, and he said, and poetry, and he said, I can't tell you what your favorite songs are going to be. And then he gave me a list of 30 poets he wanted me to read that summer, and basically asked me to come up with what my own list of great hits. And it was a lot of authority to sort of lend a sophomore, but it got me thinking about my own affinities and my own proclivities in a way that was useful, I think, at the time. So thank you. Yeah. JD? Yeah.
First of all, I'm sorry, got here late, and so if you
It's
talked
okay.
about this already, just pass by this question, but could you talk a little bit about putting a collection together, and in particular, was there a moment or illumination where you saw the end of the road for this book?
Another really thoughtful question. So this book, roughly, if I'm honest, took at least 8 years, but in some ways probably more than that, probably more like 15. I think. And I was doing other things as I was writing this book. I was writing other things, but I had to write several books into the shell of this one to finally arrive at its final form, and actually write the version of this book that I put together in 2015. None of those poems are actually still in the book. They've all been written out and put in the compost pile for the most part.
Did it have the same title?
No, actually. So one of the other working titles was the Thesaurus for a Year of Desire. But then it became apparent that, among other things, I was really interested in birds, and that it might be good to nod in the direction of the sort of secular seeker who's in some of the poems.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. But there was a moment, JD, to answer your question better. It was actually last June that I realized I couldn't imagine anything else for the book that seemed to belong in the book. And I had worked very closely with Anthony Walton on every poem and virtually every line in this book. And we were both, I think, so close to it that we couldn't necessarily see it as a full book. So I gave it to Megan, and she said, "Oh yes, this is a book. It feels finished." And so I sent it off to various publishers and contests, and it got picked up. So there was a happy ending to the story.
Yeah, well, happy ending for all of us, because now we get to read it and buy it. And on that bombshell, I wonder if maybe we should give people a chance to buy the book and to have you sign it and to come and speak
Sure.
to you. But could we have one more round of applause?
Yeah. Thank you.
No,
so
thank
much.
you. I'll make some room if people want to come and talk to you.